Unexpected events have marred what was formerly planned as a tranquil pilgrimage to Israel for religious purposes. Joni and Doug's journey reportedly took an unexpected turn, catching Jonathan and Susie off guard, according to sources. This has sent shockwaves through the household. Chatter amongst members of the party suggests an air of unease, treachery, and a potentially game-changing revelation. In reality, what transpired abroad? At long last, the shocking reality of this pilgrimage gone awry is beginning to emerge. Far from the din and prying eyes of Daystar, it all started on a peaceful morning in Montana. Nothing seemed to be moving, as if the world were frozen in time. The air was serene. On that particular morning, though, Jonathan and Susie Lamb's lives took a dramatic turn. Susie was enjoying her morning joe when she checked her phone and read a message that made her pause. Just a snapshot and a brief message from her Israeli friend, Rose Howard. Nothing flashy, no sensational headline, no shocking words. Rose had been praying at the Western Wall, a site visited by worshippers from all over the globe because it is among the holiest sites on earth. The details of Jonathan and Susie put their names on a tiny slip of paper, delicately folded it, and slipped it into a crevice between the weathered stones. Afterwards, she prayed over it, asking for healing, restoration, and serenity. She took a picture and emailed it to Susie along with a brief note. Today in Israel you are being raised up. It appeared to be a kind act at first, something a thoughtful friend would do. In spite of this, Susie felt a stirring within as she gazed at the photograph. It was impossible to turn a blind eye to the timing. Joni and Doug, who were involved with the same individuals, who had made choices that had changed their lives, were going through the same motions as Jonathan, meeting with influential people, making public appearances, and so on. God was at work in a totally other way behind the scenes, as the cameras recorded staged smiles and inspirational words. To Susie, Rose's picture wasn't merely reassuring. That was so prescient. She was pregnant with their first child when she and Jonathan went on a trip to Israel in 2017, and that brought up a memory. The Western Wall was the site of Jonathan's private prayer, humbly seeking God's direction and assistance in living according to his will. Unaware of the significance that name would have in retrospect, they had given it to their newborn son, Israel. Susie sensed a divine whisper as she beheld their names curled into the wall once more. I still perceive you. It's still my job. It was genuine, but it couldn't be made into a headline or filmed as a miracle. It was meaningful on a personal level and served as a reminder that God was faithfully and quietly crafting their tale, even in the face of uncertainty. Plans could never have been made by them. The Lambs' financial situation appeared perfect from the outside. With a surname known by millions of Christians, they were a part of a world-renowned Christian television network. As they continued camera, presided over service, and encouraged viewers with words of faith and hope, Daystar had a new generation coming up, excited, youthful, and prepared to lead the ministry into the future. Things were slowly falling apart behind the glossy grins and dazzling lights, then in a flash. Everything that transpired did not occur during a climactic argument. It started softly, almost undetected. It became strange to make small decisions. Previously friendly conversations became wary. Jonathan started to feel the upper echelons were undergoing a shift. His parents had created their ministry with prayer and faith, but now it seemed like it was all about control and managing people's perceptions. The goal of reaching people had shifted. It has to do with safeguarding a name. Jonathan was a native of that realm. He was more than just an employee at Daystar. He spent his whole life carrying on the tradition. He had witnessed the fervent and believable preaching of Marcus Lamb, his father. They construct the network with poise and resolve, along with his mother, Joni. Although he had previously held this belief, he noticed a change in attitude inside the ministry following his father's passing. A sense of increased pressure on leadership and more controversial, and people's willingness to examine everything became anathema. Jonathan attempted to force himself to stop at first. Reasoning that all ministries experience growth pains, he tried to convince himself that this was only a tough season. However, the burden was never relieved. Susie could envision it adorned with onto him. The sleepless nights, the burdened spirit, the subdued annoyance he concealed. She had great respect for his devotion and his ability to discern his life's purpose. That same allegiance, though, was now under scrutiny. His closest confidants were now the ones who paid attention to him. It all came to a head during a studio session one afternoon. Susie and Jonathan were invited to participate in a piece honoring Joni's recent marriage to Doug Weiss, a relationship that had already stirred some controversy among Christians. Jonathan was presented with a ready-to-air, positive, and encouraging pre-written statement. However, a part of him froze as he saw the words. It was too much for him to handle. It was deceitful. It didn't make him feel at ease. This meant one thing to him: in God's presence he would be vilified. There was complete stillness as soon as he declined. It was a fleeting deed, yet it had a profound impact. A disagreement escalated into a statement when it should have remained civil. It appeared to be rebellion to some. For some, betrayal was the last straw, and for leadership, it was the death knell. From then on out, things happened at a breakneck pace. Meetings summoned Jonathan and Susie had the air of more formal verdicts than casual discussions. Functions were reevaluated for them. They were no longer listed on any schedules. It ended after only 1 week. On one occasion, they were praying with viewers while co-hosting parts and smiling for the camera. They vanished the following day. Not goodbye episode, with no public approval or official statement, just quiet. That utter stillness lingered for some time. Not only were they at a loss for words, they were also unable to comprehend or make sense of what had transpired. A job was simply one of several things they had lost. All of their hard work, devotion, and faith had culminated in this life and this community. They stopped receiving calls from people they believed were friends. People who encountered them at church choose not to look each other in the eyes. Rumors began almost immediately, and others murmured about them behind their backs, repeating them. Once they've left, it was as heavy as a stone, pressing down on Jonathan's heart. He had seen ministries crumble in the past, but he never thought his own family would betray him. Initially, he did not exhibit anger. Most of the time, he was devastated. At home, Susie did her best to maintain stability. When he was unable to pray alone, she prayed on his behalf. She reassured him that no matter how much changed around him, God's calling remained constant. But on nights when nobody was home, they would sit quietly and try to figure out what had gone wrong. They finally made the most difficult choice of all: to depart from Texas. It was the sole option for actually escaping the din. They relocated to Montana, taking with them their memories, their lives, and the anguish they had endured. There weren't any flashing lights, no news teams, and no corporate gatherings, nothing but clear skies, peaceful mornings, and the deliberate process of recovery. Initially, it had an odd sensation. The continual hum of ministry life and the frantic pace of production schedules were too much for them to handle. However, a lovely thing started to happen as time went on. Once again, they began to breathe. In the quiet, they discovered tranquilly. Instead of meetings, the mornings started with prayer and coffee. Family dinners, rather than deadlines, capped off the evenings. They came upon a modest house of worship. Not much. Just a welcoming community that didn't pass judgment or ask any probing questions. Their surname and the events at Daystar were of no consequence. There was only Jonathan and Susie. In the midst of all the chaos, a couple seeks healing, listens, and ultimately God. As time went on, they started posting brief thoughts online, truthful reflections about religion, suffering, and optimism. No rants or theatrical exposés. Their remarks struck a chord. Those who had suffered from spiritual tyranny or church politics found solace in being open and honest. Their unassuming openness evolved into a form of its own ministry. No, they weren't resentful. Nobody was attempted to be brought low by them. They merely stated the obvious. When you follow God, you may have to abandon all you've worked so hard to build, no matter how much it hurts. It was discovered that not speaking out isn't necessarily a sign of weakness. There are moments when it is holy. On occasion, it's the place where God begins to restore what humanity has destroyed. Away from the limelight that had once defined them, Jonathan and Susie Lamb started to rediscover themselves in that stillness. Actually were. Neither as future TV hosts nor ministers, but as Christians rediscovering God's trustworthiness one peaceful day at a time. No fresh opportunities were being pursued by Jonathan and Susie Lamb when they uprooted their life and departed from Texas. As they escaped from ambient sound. Years after his family's heartbreaking breakup with Daystar, the ministry they had worked so hard to establish and nurture, the air was essential to their survival. Pure air. The kind that did not include recording devices, interviewers, or any sort of performance pressure. Quite the contrary, Montana felt all that they were familiar with. Nothing was demanded of them on those peaceful mornings. There were no glaring lights, no board meetings, just the vast open sky, mountains that swallowed the horizon, and silence. There was no sense of healing at first. Loss was the feeling. Their identities, routines, social circles, and sense of direction had all been shaped by their ministry for a considerable amount of time. It was the center of the universe. It was missing, and they felt adrift. There was a lot of grief and a lot of stillness. Specifically, Jonathan had a hard time adjusting. Structure and duty had been his constant companions throughout his life, as he had spent it in front of cameras. All that remained were him, his wife, and the gentle rustle of pine needles in the breeze. He had nothing to lead, fix, or prove. But perhaps that was precisely what they required. I felt lost and unprepared during my first 3 months in Montana. For a new beginning, they rented a modest home next to a lake. No one to help, no plans, and no staff. Coffee and prayer were the first things they did in the morning. For extended periods of time, they would sit quietly, not knowing how to address God. Yet after time, that stillness began to symbolize something holy. Instead of writing for an audience or a sermon, Jonathan resumed keeping a notebook for his own reflections. Small routines brought Susie serenity, lengthy. They take walks, prepare meals, and read aloud to their children from the Bible. They had lost touch with the art of living a simple life. A nearby church was their destination one Sunday. There was a lack of professionalism and polish. No televisions were present. In a dimly lit room with squeaky wooden floorboards, where only a small number of families had congregated. They hoped no one would see them as they crept in stealthily. No one gave them the VIP treatment that celebrities or scandal survivors get, though. None of the pastors inquired regarding Daystar. Attendees refrained from interfering. A young couple who appeared exhausted and in need of a break were warmly welcomed as Jonathan and Susie. They settled down at that church. Although it lacked perfection, it was authentic. As a result, they were able to worship freely and relax. They weren't acting religiously for a long time. Living it up, they were. Praying simply, doing tiny acts of kindness beautifully, and being a part of a community that didn't require wow your audience. Get well took time. It was still difficult on sometimes. Every morning, the waves of betrayal would wash over me. There were other times when they questioned whether or not leaving had been the best decision. However, following that, something mild would transpire. Something profound said in a sermon or written in a verse. A subtle assurance that God was still with them. Rebuilding them was happening, but not in the way they had anticipated. People started contacting us as the months went by. Not from the mainstream media, but rather the periphery. Complete strangers who had witnessed their silent exit and identified with the anguish they had seen. Church wounds, spiritual deception, and faith loss were themes they conveyed. Sir Jonathan, it started to sink in for Susie and them that their tale wasn't unique. It belonged to a greater whole, a spiritual uprising that seeks Jesus Christ apart from religious politics. They resumed their ministry without intending to. Offset from on a platform, but rather by virtue of their genuineness, Jonathan began publishing brief reflections online. Just some brief reflections on faith, disappointment, and optimism. Nothing too deep. When Susie was at her lowest, she started sharing passages that had gotten her through. They weren't motivated by people who pay attention to you. Because they were unable to remain silent in the face of God's work in their life, even in the desert, they did it. Their forthrightness upset me. The public has had enough of hypocritical preachers and their flawless personas. They for an authentic experience. That unadulterated trust was being bestowed to them by Jonathan and Susie. They were forthright about their suffering and didn't act as if they knew everything. Uncertainty, bewilderment, and reestablishing trust were topics of conversation. And somehow that sincerity attracted forging a deeper relationship with God. The sense of exile and the sense of freedom in Montana began to fade as time went on. Their recovery seems to be reflected in the landscape. Enormous, untamed, and exquisitely simple. Jonathan would pray aloud as he drove for hours across the mountain roads, as he allowed himself to be still and know that God was with him. The little things brought Susie peace. The sound of their children's laughter, the patter of rain on the roof, and the comforting atmosphere of a peaceful home. The establishment of a new ministry was not hurried. It was allowed by them. The timing is with God. And as he was doing it, a change occurred within them. A sense of direction emerged from the agony. Grips that had earlier been too painful now bore witness to God's mercy. They understood that sometimes it's for the best to lose everything. How to discover the truth. After a long day of service, Jonathan looked across at Susie and whispered, "Maybe this is what ministry was always meant to be. Just walking with God, helping people one heart at a time." Susie nodded, smiled, and whispered back, "It's a beautiful thing. Adequate." Indeed it was, because they discovered something in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the media, that the cameras would never have been able to catch. Calm down. The calm that comes from letting God write your story instead of striving to change it. On the contrary, the Lamb family wasn't rushing from one broadcast to another or chasing deadlines for the first time in years. With the arrival of autumn, Montana's air became crisp, the days became shorter, and the weight of quiet lifted. That was a restorative experience. Susie and Jonathan have finally made it to allocation, where tranquilly didn't seem unattainable. However, amidst that tranquilly, a change was discernible. At first, it was barely audible, like a wind whisper just before morning or a subtle hum just before a storm. Neither of them could put their finger on what it was, but knew in their hearts that God was not finished yet. Months had passed while Jonathan had fought off thoughts of Daystar. Reliving the events was something he preferred not to do. Hoped that resentment wouldn't grow. However, on occasion, he would receive a feedback from an individual who was a former network viewer, someone who felt he was absent from television, or someone whose narrative inspired them to break free from their own destructive relationships. Such statements are usually devastating. Their words served as a gentle reminder that his platform had not meant his calling had vanished, and Susie did as well. She observed as people began to relate to Jonathan once more, not due to his fame, but to the kindness in his heart. Marcus and Joni's son wasn't the reason they were there. A man who had walked the walk was going to speak to them, defied the flames while maintaining faith. Now his speech seemed more natural, less contrived. His discussion of faith was not theoretical. Everything revolved around staying alive. At their home, they began to hold little gatherings, a small gathering of neighbors and friends who wished to pray and share stories about God. There were no official representatives, no cameras, and no advertising. The nights were lovely and raw. There was genuine emotion, laughter, tears, and an honesty that transcended the need for microphones and spotlights. Those who had previously abandoned the church began to return. Sitting in Jonathan's living room, those who claimed they were done with religion found themselves talking about grace again. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill revival. There was a rise in his gently waking up. However, individuals were conversing outside of their tranquil Montana enclave. Word got around, some optimistic, some dramatic. There were rumblings on the internet that Jonathan was being readied for a possible comeback to the ministry, more substantial, a curative force. Some even went so far as to say that he might have been sent to usher Daystar into a golden age. The idea frightened him. He drew the line at returning to a world that had caused him so much pain. However, concurrently, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that God could have something more to do. The next thing you knew, it was confirmation. It was unremarkable. It was peaceful, as are most heavenly moments. While in Israel, a friend sent them a written communication. She had jotted down their initials. In the crevices of the western wall, Jonathan and Susie Lamb scribbled their names on a little slip of paper. This is the very same wall where Jonathan, as a young spouse, had prayed for divine guidance many years ago. The very same wall that he had committed to doing God's will regardless of the cost in a covenant prayer. He felt a rush of shock at seeing that snapshot. It was as if God was stating, "I haven't forgotten. The story isn't over." That moment ignited a fire within him. There was no major announcement that he made. Refrained from beginning to plot a return. He did, however, start dreaming again. I care more about people than about fame or television. Human beings. the ones who were looking for truth after being wounded by ministries, who had lost trust in leadership. He started to fantasize about how something new could be constructed. A community, not just another network. A spot where honesty superseded it, with an emphasis on Jesus rather than the brand. He could always count on Susie's unwavering support. Neither was she seeking attention or a spotlight. A leader by love and example, she had discovered her inner strength during those peaceful years. She started posting more words online about forgiveness, healing, and finding solace in nature. Her remarks struck a chord. Her voice became known as the gentle fire, mild yet strong, serene yet persuading. They started to realize as a group that everything they had been through had led up to this point: the heartache, the rejection, and the quiet. It served a purpose. There was training. Something untainted had been left behind after it had purged pride, ego, and terror. They had ceased to require approval from other sources. They merely wished to be of service. Not everyone in Texas was overjoyed to see their power resurging. Reportedly, some Daystar insiders felt concerned. They said behind Jonathan's back that God was returning the mantle to its rightful place through a gentle comeback. Whatever the veracity of those rumors, one thing was evident. Genuineness was in high demand, and Jonathan and Susie exemplified it. The lambs, in their subtle manner, had evolved into signifying the return to health, demonstrating that religion can persevere in the face of institutional uncertainty. On occasion, Jonathan would give talks at conferences and local churches. Truth, rather than hype, always seemed to electrify the crowd whenever he did it. Not once did he mention distress or disgrace. Grace, he said, is able to restore what others have destroyed, and even after suffering a complete and utter loss, there is serenity. More and more people showed there as he continued to share. His sincerity, more than his fame, was the reason. The change was palpable to them. Their expectations for ministry had been high, and this was far lower. The texture was uncooked. It lacked grandeur. Also, it was genuine. If Susie were tote times accompany him, her voice firm and brimming with kindness. They collaborated to depict a faith that was more about tenacity than perfection. That subtle stirring within them started to materialize as the months grew into years. Something they were working on got underway. New. A project that provided a sanctuary for healing rather than merely another program or place of worship. A safe space for Christians to open up, ask tough questions, and rediscover their faith. They preferred not to refer to it as a ministry. They meant to refer to it as a movement. Perhaps that was precisely that. Their training ground and wilderness, Jonathan would say time and time again, had become Montana, similar to how David was. Anointed in the fields, and Moses discovered his vocation, while in exile, this season had served as a refining fire for them. After a while, the agony subsided. That which was irrelevant, a sense of purpose, remained. Standing outside their home one evening, they watched the sun set behind the mountains. As he leaned in toward Susie, Jonathan whispered, "You feel it." I sensed something approaching as well. She nodded, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "Yeah," she responded. "This time, though, we have no say in the matter. All we do is follow. What this fresh chapter entailed. Following. Rather from seeking fame or repairing tarnished reputations, we should follow God's will regardless of how the road may appear unsuccessful to others. Reason being, they realized that having millions of viewers or global influence wasn't the true measure of success. Listening to God's voice and responding positively was it. The platform fall was no longer central to their story. It was about finding that faith endures even in the face of adversity and rebuilding one's life after a devastating setback. There it establishes firmly, more robustly, and unmovable roots. Something became crystal evident when their surroundings started paying attention again. There would be no reunion of Jonathan and Susie Lamb to resume their former responsibilities. They were entering an uncharted territory. A new beginning, not a return to the past. A new era was beginning, one that was not based on precedents. Facts formed its foundation.